morning. Thank you for joining us for the Hayworth College of Business Entrepreneurship Forum. I'm Amy Kokenauer, an administrative assistant at the college, and I will be serving as the host. Before we get started, I'll explain the format and overview for today. Satish Deshpande, Dean of the Hayworth College of Business, will introduce our speaker, Ken Miller. His presentation will be followed by a Q&A session. Please use the Q&A or chat feature to enter questions. With that, I would like to introduce Satish Deshpande.
Thank you, Amy. Welcome. I am Satish Deshpande, Dean of the Haverco College of Business. Thank you for joining us today. The sponsor for this event is Blue Ox Credit Union. I thank them for supporting the college and the businesses in our local community. Ken Miller, our speaker today, is the owner and co-founder of Millennium Restaurant Group, which owns and operates several restaurants in Southwest Michigan, including Martell's, Center Street Tap House, and Fieldhouse Grill. Miller previously co-founded multiple business ventures and serves as a trustee of the WMU Foundation and as a member of the Board of Directors of the Thomas M. Cooley Law School. He is also the former chair of WMU's Board of Trustees. Ken, welcome to Haverco College.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Amy. Thank you for the introduction. I obviously have a very soft spot in my heart for Haverco College of Business and for Western Michigan University. So I truly appreciate the opportunity, and for everybody who's listening in. I've been asked to talk a little bit about my career, my entrepreneurial history, kind of what's happened since. I exited Haverco College almost 50 years ago. Of course, it wasn't called Haverco College back then, nor was it in its current location, but the education was the same, the foundation was the same. If I were to give a title to what I'm about to speak to today, I would call it Food, Foam, Finance, FM, Femurs, and Pharmaceuticals. I apparently like to invest in the word F, or the sound of the word F, but those are all products, believe it or not, over the last 30 to 40 years that we have started, we being my brother and I. And it's a very diverse, not connected product line, and I'll explain to you exactly how all of that happened post-grad school. It's really not a template. I would not argue that this would be a template for everybody. It's something that worked for me. On hindsight, I didn't necessarily have it as a plan. I was not, when I came out of grad school, 1970, frankly, I wasn't connected. I wasn't necessarily brilliant, and I certainly didn't have a lot of funding. So I knew that I wanted to get into business, but I had to be independent for whatever it was worth. Since 1970, believe it or not, I've never had a paycheck. Not with one of my companies, not when I was a lawyer, not when I was a salesman, not when I was an investor. I've always decided to never be the burden, and so I've never had a paycheck, have been able to survive. And the key ingredients there are basically to show up, participate, be flexible, and seize every opportunity you can get your hands on. And that would be, I would have advice for everybody, particularly those coming out of grad school that are in a similar situation as me. Network. You never know when that next handshake is going to establish a relationship that might change your life. And it happened to me a couple times. And as a result, I guess you could call it either blind faith, blind ambition, or just blind luck. But all three came into play for me over the years, and I've been blessed as a result of it. But the genesis for me, as is going to be for most of you, was Haverco College, both as undergrad, but more importantly, I got serious in grad school. That was the true genesis. Whether it triggered something in me or not, I don't know, but all of a sudden I fell in love with investment, business, etc. I had a plan to immediately attend law school right out of grad school in 1970. That was the plan, were it not for Vietnam. And so I was inducted and deducted on the same day, believe it or not, from the Army. So health issues that they caught. But as a result, I had already pulled my application for law school, et cetera. And I decided that, well, I have to go to work. And I started out by selling computers for Burroughs Corporation. Many of you may have never heard of Burroughs. It merged eventually. It was a pretty good sized company back then. For 4.5 years, I sold small to medium computers. Back then, the computers that I sold for literally close to $1 million did not have the power or the speed of the cell phone that you're probably holding on to right now. It's an amazing transformation from that period in time to now. So with law school, I got out when I was 30 as a result of the 4.5 years with Burroughs, grad school, undergrad school. And I started over again. Of course, when you're a freshman in college, you're starting over. When you're first year grad school, you're starting over. And when you're first year law school, you're starting over. And then I find myself first year of practice of law, starting over. But that's just how things play out. I partnered and practiced law for about 15 years. And I did that intentionally. One, I needed the income. Two, I needed the basis. I still wanted to get into venture capital work. Now, my venture capital is very small by comparison to what you read many times in Wall Street Journal, et cetera, but it was still what I wanted to do. So I figured that if I could use law for the basis and as a fallback position, that would help, but it would also give me an introduction into opportunities for other things, which absolutely it did. I teamed up with my brother, who was also a lawyer at the time, and we formed a law firm and an investment company. It was Miller & Miller Law Firm. It was Haverco Inc., Investments and Finances, and it was just the two of us. And we made our first venture with a company called Biomet back in 1979. And I'll go into that in a little bit because it's strange how it all happened, and it goes into the blind luck thing I talked about a minute ago. Since Biomet in 1979 and up until 2000, so during those 30 years, we created almost 35 separate entities, companies. Large ones, Biomet, which prior to acquisition by someone else had 6,000 to 7,000 employees. Individual restaurants, we've had manufacturing companies, all the things that I talked about, started a bank. So those 35, and they all exist still today. I have no participation with any of them anymore. They've all been moved on, merged, whatever, with the exception of the restaurant business. So, but I'm proud that I was able to initiate work with those 35 different companies. Wide variety of people, wide variety of product, geography, and certainly over a 30-year period of time, it worked. The first two that we got invested with at the time, Biomet, and then within 2 years, a company called ETI, Enterprise Technologies, Inc. It was an oil company. And those two, within 2 years of each other, they taught me two things. We'll go about that in just a minute. One, blind luck does work. I got into Biomet as a result of walking into the lobby of the Comerica building in 1978, and an individual who thought I was someone else. He was a securities officer here in town. He thought I was someone else, pulled me aside and said, "I have an investment I want you to take a look at." Thinking again that I was somebody else. And I said, "Sure." I did. It was Biomet Orthopedics Company. And the rest of that is history when he finally realized that I wasn't the guy he thought I was. We'd already committed to buy the company. So that is happenstance. That is just pure luck. But it worked. We did significant due diligence on Biomet, or at least naively what we thought was significant due diligence at the time. Spent time at the company, spent time with the family, spent time studying orthopedics and et cetera. On reflection, it seems rather simplistic compared to what we ended up doing later as far as due diligence, but it was sufficient at the time. We seized that opportunity and moved forward. That was a success. What it taught me, though, is that success is not permanent, because within a year of that success, I created a monumental failure with Enterprise Technologies, an oil company. I rolled over everything that I had made. And going back on Biomet, we went public in 1983. I was 35 years old. It was an exceptionally successful company at the time. I had, as most people would say, was set for life at the age of 35. But I decided to leverage it and buy another company. So within 2 years, I went from being set for life, frankly, to being flat broke again. It was a very painful experience at the age of 35. Biomet had gone from being an orthopedic equipment manufacturer for joints and bones. It became fourth worldwide. At the time, slightly larger than Stryker. Eventually, Stryker acquired a competitive and became larger than us. And then 20-some years later, 28 years later, it was sold to a consortium out of New York, KKR, TPG, Goldman Sachs. But the experience gained, 28 years on the board, 20 years as audit committee chair, and 28 years on the executive committee, those all stayed with me, because even though I'd lost, frankly, the investment, I remained active on the board. And that was a blessing. With the Enterprise Oil Company, I learned that while success is not permanent, failure isn't necessarily fatal. I thought I was destroyed at the time. Enterprise Oil was a alternative fuel company back in early 1980s, when oil at the time was skyrocketing. Enterprise Technologies, we had wells in 9 different states. We had 4 different large fuel oil depots around the country. And we would take regular fuel oil, we would mix it with coal fines, that little dust that comes up when you mine coal, and then we would use an emulsifier and mix it with water. So we were taking number 6 fuel oil and turning it into about a 30% less cost per gallon than straight up number 6 fuel oil, which big industrial individuals, the EPA now today, I don't think would even permit it, but at the time, it had great potential. Unfortunately, the price of oil dropped and alternative energy became less enthusiastic. And I took over the company, moved it here to Kalamazoo, and for 5 years remained the executive in charge, and finally merged it with what is today known as a SPAC, and it went public. But it went public basically as a shell, only to team up with, I can't remember now exactly who it was. But again, I go back to the success is not permanent and failure is not fatal, and I can't stress that enough. Everybody is going to achieve some level of success, I hope, and you should enjoy it. And you should go to bed at night comforted by the fact that you've got that success. But remember, if you're moving forward, there are opportunities out there that might not be as productive, might fail, but they're not fatal. I've never run into a failure of any kind that was really fatal in my life. With that, those two, I was faced with quite a few decisions. I was 35 years old. Um, still had investments in a couple companies, still could practice law, but I had to think hard of what I was going to do next. I could fold, get out of the industry, the investment industry, because it was painful and I didn't have any sources again. I could just go practice law, but I'd already decided that that wasn't the course that I wanted to take, or I could try again and get up off the mat and start another investment of some kind. Being challenged in life like that is inevitable, but being defeated by it is purely optional. And so I don't want to say the luxury. I was married, never have had children. I did have that luxury of a wife who was very supportive and said, go at it again. I could either let my fear be my gravity or I could let my fear be my motivator. And I was fearful going forward at 35. Of course, at 35, I thought I was impervious and would live forever. But anyway, the old saying about quitters never win and winners never quit. I disagree with that because winners do quit. They just quit the right stuff at the right time. And this was time for me to walk away from enterprise in particular, to stay with Biomet, accept what had happened to me, as monumental as it was, and do a deep dive essentially on what went right with my first investment, what went wrong with my second investment, and what resources did I have to even get started again. What you go through will help you get through. And that experience, particularly more with enterprise, the failure than the success, taught me a lot of things. And I moved on with Biomet, with law, and one other small investment at the time. And I have always liked the statement someone made about Darwin. And I believe it's it. Darwin didn't say, when he said survival of the fittest, we've all heard it. Survival of the fittest. He didn't mean fittest in terms of strength, money, or anything that we normally associate with being fittest. The actual phrasing was the species that can adapt and adjust to a changing environment. That's the one that will survive. Ants and sharks, they're not necessarily the brightest, but over 1 million years, they have adjusted to everything that Mother Nature and mankind has thrown at them, and they're still here. And I believe that the same thing happens to us on a much smaller scale. That if you can adapt and if you can adjust, you will succeed. That's a very, very critical component, I believe, because if you can't, you pretty much locked yourself in. Anytime someone says, why did we do it this way? And they say, because that's the way we've always done it. And if you haven't heard that, I'm sure you're going to at some point in your life. I would turn and I'd run because that's a very fatal error in most things. And the ability to adapt and to adjust, particularly in today's world, the technology alone, the philosophies, everything, even in the business world, whether it's finance, law, or whatever, it's evolving, it's changing. And so be flexible, be ready to move on, move around. I talk about it too, about football, quarterback. If you think about it, every play in football is designed for a touchdown. They don't necessarily design them for 1 yard or 5 yards. That's what happens more often than not. But if everybody on your team does exactly what they're supposed to, you should get a touchdown. The problem is the guys on the other side of the line, they haven't read your playbook and they don't know exactly what you're thinking that they're going to do. So they don't. They adjust. Quarterback goes to the line, not with perfect knowledge. He goes to the line with 70% of the knowledge he needs, and he puts the ball in play. And then they adjust and they adopt. The better ones do the better scores. So I don't mean to harp on it too much, but it's probably one of the singular biggest lessons that I've ever learned is to not be intransient. If someone comes in with an idea, I have never, ever said no the first time. Even if I wasn't really looking for a new idea. Who knows? what's waiting around the corner because of those kind of opportunities. The other thing that I did do with the companies that we were involved with, I became immersed in every aspect with Biomet. I joined the AAOS, American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons. I was very light in my knowledge of orthopedics at the time, but I went to every convention, went to every conference that I possibly could to learn what I possibly could. Did the same thing with the company called HandsVet. It was a machine tool company. I went to what's called the IMTS, International Machine Tool Trade Show every year, and to conferences, so I could learn about various machine tool techniques. When we got into radio, which I'll talk about in just a second, went to the National Association of Broadcasters every year. It became my permanent job, really, was to learn, take the learning back to the investment. And of course, by 1991, we'd gotten out of law completely and focused entirely just on the investment. So at this point in life, we had HandsVet, we had Biomet. And what HandsVet came out in 1981 when we bought HandsVet. 1981, for those of you who were either there or don't remember, but have read about it, was a disastrous economic year. Prime rate was 18%, and our company was borrowing money at 4+ prime. So we were borrowing money at 22%. If you can possibly imagine the burden that places on a company. We were able to turn it around. We were able to hang on to it for 20 years. And, you know, it's not always a matter of playing good cards. Sometimes it's a matter of playing a poor hand. And once again, due diligence got us into a company at a bad time, but we moved on with machine tool, hung on to that for another 20 some years, along with Biomet. And then in the mid 80s, 1985, I was standing in my driveway, and my neighbor was a CPA. And he came over and said, "You guys ever thought about buying a radio station?" Out of the clear blue. And I said, "No, but I've not really thought about buying anything we've bought so far. It just happened." And he said, "Well, I've got an opportunity with a client who wants to buy a radio station and wants to know if maybe you and your brother would get involved." So the 5 of us made a play for a local radio station, got beat out on the bid, then decided that, well, we've got the money, we've got the team, and let's go find a radio station. Unfortunately, the one we found was all the way out in California, but turned out to be a very lucky move. We stayed with those 2 stations, actually bought 2 stations in Modesto, California, stayed with those for 2 years, and then we bought our partners out. They thought, well, geez, this is pretty good. We made good money in 2 years. We're moving on. And my brother and I just took the other attitude. This is pretty good. We made good money. Let's roll it over again. So we bought additional stations up in Redding, California, and then in Reno, Nevada. And then we had a great opportunity to buy from John Fetzer's company, but it's now B93. At that time it was WJFM and WKZO right here in our backyard. We had not anticipated that that was going to happen. The significance of it is that WJFM, before it became WBCT, is the most powerful radio signal in the world, sitting right up there in Grand Rapids, 325,000 watts. No radio signal in the commercialized world is more powerful than that. And surprisingly, the 3rd most powerful radio signal is WOOD. That's also up in Grand Rapids. That's 250,000 watts. The most you can get now is 50,000. So that signal, we were thinking, could cover all the way over into Wisconsin, Northern Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and all of Michigan. Not just Southwest Michigan, but all of it. And we also then took it country. In the mid 80s to 90, country was the thing in music-wise. About 25% of all stations in the country, believe it or not, were country stations. And within a very short period of time, actually within a year and a half. We not only did that station go from being 14th ranked in the market of 19 stations in Grand Rapids, it went to being the #1 country station in the country in just a year and a half. So they were exciting times, to say the least. And it was a glorious opportunity. A few years later, the law changed. This is another adapt and adjust. At one time, you could only own one station in a market. And you couldn't own a TV station and a radio station in the same market. Well, then the FCC allowed regulatorily what they call duopoly. You could own two stations in the same market, or actually even more, as long as you didn't control the market, less than 50% of the listenership. Well, the big money, CBS, MS Broadcasting, Clear Channel, names you probably have heard, big money, public money, they decided to come into the market. And my brother and I had to decide to either go big or go home, either get more stations, start doubling up in the markets we were already in, which was 7 stations in 3 states, or move on. Once again, quitters never win. Well, this was the time to quit, to be honest with you, because we were going to be smothered. And we had an opportunity, a great opportunity, to sell the station to Clear Channel, who still owns it. At the time, they came into Grand Rapids and bought Wood and us, and kind of control that market now. As a matter of fact, Clear Channel has, for what it's worth, 11 stations up in that market. So I'm glad we didn't try to stay and compete with them. But that we stayed with radio from 85 until about 97. It was a wild ride, to say the least. It was fun. It was entertaining. And unlike some of the others, orthopedics in particular, and even EDM machines for hands that it was non-technical. It was easy for me to grasp onto. At this point, I was also starting to buy restaurants. We still had the other investments going. We were out of the practice of law. I started buying restaurants, and I'm going to save that for just a minute because it's the one thing that I still have activity in. We started another company called Avtech. It was a pharmaceutical testing laboratory. The original intent for Avtech in 1990 was to do what they call gravity feed pharmaceutical production. Started really in 87. We did a dog and pony show for some investment bankers. In 1989, things kind of changed and went south in the market. We ended up deciding, well, what could we do with this investment if we just self-financed it and adjusted the concept a little bit. So we went from production of pharmaceuticals to testing of pharmaceuticals. The first attempts with like I said, with the dog and pony show weren't there, but we had a team of scientists already ready to go from Upjohn at that time. And we decided that we would go into the analytical services business, pharmaceuticals, mostly the major houses, get into the state-of-the-art analytical technology, which is required if you're going to work with the major houses. Candidates at that time, and they were all the ones that you would hear of today, that were developing new pharma. They were candidates for FDA approval, but they had to have outside independent testing. So with mass spec and some liquid chromatography, and don't ask me how those things necessarily work. I'm much better to tell you how a radio station and a restaurant works. We ended up actually having a very nice investment from 1990 to almost 2009 when we sold it to a Finnish company. And it still exists today, and it's still here in Kalamazoo. So then, as we were working with the other companies, we started a company called Team, T-E-A-M, Team Industries. And that same year, we started Keystone Community Bank. Team Industries we had plants in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and Virginia, Winchester, Virginia. We manufactured EPS, expanded polystyrene, which is basically a coffee cup, but about 300 pounds at a time. Big square blocks of EPS. And in fact, at the time, we even did a study with the WMU seniors, helped us do some of our due diligence for us. It was fun for them and it was great for us. Products that we use that you have probably seen almost every day, flooring and RVs. We use what they call noodles, the packing stuff that you hate when you open a box. We make them. We made them. We also made what's called SIPs, structurally insulated panels, for insulating a house, insulating construction, industrial in particular. You start with a very small silicate bead. You put it through a heat expander. You mold it, you cure it, you cut it, and you sell it. So once again, what we did there when we sold radio, we were prevented from with non-competes from getting back into the industry. And I don't think anybody is necessarily afraid of me getting back in the industry, but they didn't want our people getting back into the industry. So a couple of them came with us and said, well, we used to sell air on radio. We could sell puffed air when it came to this. And it was a company that really just was not technical. It needed money. It needed some marketing. It needed a national exposure, not just a regional, and had great what we call roll-up potential. There were about 12 other similar manufacturers around the country. So we moved on with that once again. It worked out. It worked out well for us. And we held on to that along with all the other ones until about 2009 or 2010. And once again, I'll go into that in a minute. Keystone Community Bank, for those who remember back in the late 90s when First of America was being acquired by Nat City, when Old Kent Bank was being acquired by Fifth Third, and the big nationals were coming in and taking over, and the community banks were almost non-existent in this town. So there were 5 of us got together and formed Keystone Community Bank. And we stayed strong with our focus on community banking right up until we had an offer from a large regional bank, First of Michigan. They acquired us, and then Mercantile. So Keystone Bank is now Mercantile. While I would say that the original concept of community banking was always in my heart and in my mind, when you get an offer and the shareholders accept it, time to move on. So we did. And finally, we got into investment with restaurants. Bought the first one. Many people think that I know a lot about food and wine. I don't. I was young, single, hungry, and thirsty, so I bought a bar. It's as simple as that. Back in 1987, with two other young guys. I was 40. They were in their 20s. They knew how to run the thing because everybody says restaurants are tough. Don't get in the business. Well, truth is, restaurants are tough, but I don't know of anything that's not. Every business we've gotten in has some level of overhead, regulation, whatever. Radio, you had the FCC and major money to fight against. Biomet, you had the SEC and the Food and Drug Administration to fight against. Hansvet, at the time, we had 18% interest, and more than that. With banking, you always had the big gorilla players and regulators. So those are all very difficult businesses. My belief at the time, be honest with you, was why not take the same business model that we at least were used to in our life with Biomet, with Hansvet, with Avtech, with Keystone, with Team, and apply that same business model to a restaurant. Don't make it a hobby. Don't make it a young guy that's thirsty and hungry and a bar owner. Why not turn this out of a hobby and into a business? So we started with the concept that we wanted to be a professional restaurant company for professional restaurant people, people who want this as a career. Now, 50% of our employees are not planning on staying in this business. 50% of our employees, frankly, are Western students who work the front of the house, as we say, as waiters and servers, and they are going to become accountants, school teachers, et cetera. We know that. But there are those that have hospitality in their blood and want to stay in the hospitality industry, and we encourage that through additional education, et cetera. I bought a couple partners out back in 1999 and changed what was then the company called BSOP into Millennium Restaurant Group. Millennium, obviously being, it was formed in December of 1999 and became active in January of 2000, thus Millennium. And started out with just two restaurants and the theme that I just mentioned, restaurant company for restaurant people. And we were off and running, and we have been adding regularly since. I have been active, former chair of the Michigan Restaurant and Lodging Association, been on that board for about 15 years. It has been a phenomenal experience in so many ways. The people you deal with, the industry. I am not an operating guy. I haven't been an operating guy in any of the businesses that we've been involved in. I do what I call the business of business. The business of molding, the business of manufacturing, the business of pharmaceutical testing. They were all people that could do that far better. And no matter how immersed I got in educating, I always knew that the people that actually would run the companies would have to be smarter, better than I am in the actual core idea. But the business of business doesn't change a lot, to be honest with you, whether it was Biomet or orthopedics or whether it's restaurants. So the application of those same business rules, I mean, you work on a margin. It's money in, money out. Try to do it at a margin and try to live within your margin. Simple as that. A lot of people who know restaurants and want to do restaurants and think that they can do it better than anybody else don't understand the business of business. Thus, everybody thinks it's going to be difficult, and it is if you don't understand the need for business application, regardless of the business. I have stayed very active with Western over the last 30 years, not just because I've been here in town. I've stayed there because I owe it to Western, I think. I love the university. I love this community. They've been very generous to me in terms of moral support and everything else. And more importantly, it was my genesis. They always say that if you rise to a level of success, you have an obligation to send the elevator back down. So I thought whatever I can do, either for the university as a whole, for being on the board of trustees or on the foundation. I have worked with Satish and Haverco College on his business advisory board in past days. Same thing with the College of Fine Arts. But I would also encourage anybody and everybody out there, whether it's for altruistic purposes or for commercial purposes, stay involved both with Western and whatever community that you get involved in. I think I think it's a right. I also think it's a sense of obligation, to be honest with you, for people to serve, to give back. Amy, how's my time?
You are good. We just have a few more minutes.
Okay,
If you
I'll
want
just wrap up and
you have some questions.
okay. I say this somewhat self-deprecating, but I also believe this, that because of Western, I am educated beyond my intelligence. Again, nothing against undergrad, but grad school and Haverco College, the business college, were exceptionally meaningful to me, and took an ordinary man and gave me some extraordinary opportunities. Now, I give myself credit for seizing those opportunities, but I cannot state enough what what Western has a foundational, as you know with anything else, with a building, if the foundation's weak, you're probably going to have problems all the time. My foundation was strong because of Western. There's additional life lessons to be learned from all of this. And each one would probably, if you were to have gone through the same sequence of business investments, the ups, the downs, the opportunities, each of you would probably have a little different life lesson to pass on. These are mine, and I'm a strong believer in being a servant leader, so to speak, that I think a life that is successful does require the serving of others and everybody. Even though you sit there now, you've got time, talent, or money, one of the other. And there are organizations out there that will accept any one of those. They need you and your time and your talent and or your money if you're lucky enough to have it. So I would close with this, with I don't want to say a parable, but a statement from Warren Buffett that we all sit in the shade of a tree because someone planted it a long time ago. So much of what has been good in my life occurred because of the shade of a tree someone else planted long before I got here. So the obligation is to keep planting, so that 40 years from now, hopefully somebody will be talking at Haverco College and will be able to do so because they were sitting under the shade of a tree that I planted. So, and whatever that, and again, whatever that conjures up in your mind as to planting a tree, do something for the benefit of those coming over the bridge after you. So that is probably enough. I want to thank you all so much for listening, and for the opportunity to even be here. And Amy, I'm going to switch it back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I love that analogy of the tree too. We do have a few questions. Our first one, if you had to go back in time and change something you did, got a lot of time to choose from, what would it be and why?
Now, there are a couple of things that I would say there. First, and we probably have all done this analysis in our lives before. To me, the problem with going back in time and changing something bad that happened to you, in fairness, if you go back to that point in time, you're going to change everything, including the good stuff. And how many of us really want to run that risk, I guess. So, but if it were possible, and the obvious answer would probably be, I wish I hadn't invested in enterprise because it cost me a lot of time and stress in my life. But even more importantly, I think I would want to go back to the beginning of undergrad school. And I have thought about this, and I truly believe it. My foundation started in grad school. I lingered for 4 years in undergrad school. I was in business. I was at the business college and so forth, but I didn't apply. I didn't really pursue anything. I simply survived. And I wished I had really taken a more aggressive approach at that time. Now, maybe that's asking too much for an 18-year-old kid coming out of high school, but I've seen 18-year-old kids coming out of high school that do apply better than what I did. So I would probably go back to the starting line almost, and be a little more aggressive about what I did.
Great. All right. Another one is, since the restaurant industry has gone through a lot of changes during the COVID pandemic, curbside pickup, outdoor seating, that kind of thing, are there facets of that that you think will remain even once we get through this challenge?
I do, and actually, and I apologize because I did have a section I was going to talk about on COVID, but good Lord, I don't know where to start or stop when it gets to COVID right now. And if anybody does, please call me right after this, because everything I hear evolves, it changes, and I'm not blaming anybody. Let's face it, 18 months ago, 20 months ago, this was new to everybody. And when going back to March 16th of last year, we received 24-hour notice to close down 10 restaurants and lay off 550 people. So we really didn't get that. I got the notice Sunday night. The notice happened Monday morning at 9 o'clock, and by 5 o'clock, we had to shut everything down. and send everybody home. I was heartbreaking, to be honest with you, not just for what it did to those that worked for me and had worked for me for years in many respects, plus the fear of, I had a lot invested in 10 restaurants. Were they going to open up again? Originally, it was going to be for 2 weeks. I believed that. Well, then it was 2 more weeks, and I believed that. Then it was 2 months, and I believed that. So then we were open again, but only half. Then we got shut down again. So in answer to the question, some of the protocols I do believe are going to be permanent. I liken it back to 9/11. I never thought that I would permanently have to take off my shoes and take off my belt to get on an airplane. But it's part of life, and you don't even think about it anymore. I don't know whether masks are going to become a permanent, whether vaccinations. I don't know whether vaccinations are going to become required. That's in the courts right now. So the answer is yes. I think COVID has made a permanent change in the protocols of our life, but I just don't know what they're going to be yet because it's ever changing. It will. I would love to know what the quote new norm, and I hate that term because it's so trite, but I would love to know what the new norm is so I could adjust to it.
All right. Yeah, I think all of us feel that same way. Another question, how did the pandemic affect the Millennium Group business strategy? And what was the thought process that went into the closing of the Union downtown?
Good questions. Thought process for Millennium as far as COVID was survive initially, and it really was no more than that. We wanted to still be in line when the ticket window opened up again, and we had to do whatever we could. And I don't know if you go back to, or how many would know this, but the takeout business that provided maybe 8% of our gross revenue normally. And with it, we were able to keep about 40 people employed. So we did what we could with takeout, with Grubhub, with Dine and Dash, and some of those places. But it was nominal, and we weren't going to survive on that alone. So last winter, we did everything we could from igloos to pods to create dining experience outside. And when I mean pods, I mean moving pods. Ones that you see on the back of trucks. We called a company, they brought a dozen of them to us. We converted them into dining rooms, put heat in them, we decorated them, put little mini fireplaces in them, put radio, XM in them. And people, believe it or not, flocked to those because it was the only option they had. There was not indoor dining last year. So it was that kind of a strategy. It was to, again, adapt and adjust. I've had 35 years of data on my restaurants. I could tell you within a small difference what business is going to do today because I've got 30 years of history and it doesn't change a lot. Friday night this time last year, we had X number of people working and we did so much in revenue, but all of that went out the window. We had nothing after 30 some years of data and background. So we had to project going forward blindly, which made it very difficult. But the strategy was stay tight, stay flexible, and just basically do whatever we could. And I got to give the people who worked for me, 4 of them have been with me 30 plus years, what they went through, both with their families and themselves, with payback, with payroll cuts, etc. They did just an absolutely unbelievable job of keeping the glue together for all the companies. With the union, when COVID first hit, going back to March 16th, we own some of our buildings, but some we lease. And this is not an exaggeration, I had 4 landlords call me within a day saying, looks like we're in for a tough ride. What can we do to help? Because they were shut down. We've got no revenue. We didn't know how long we were going to be shut down. Now, of course, they had, I don't want to say self-serving, but they had to be concerned about it. They had mortgages to pay themselves, and they wanted to make sure we too were still in line. when the cloud was lifted because of COVID. So we did. We restructured deals with every one of our landlords. And most of it was give us 6 months of rent abeyance and add it to the end of the lease. So you don't lose anything. You're just going to get it later. And every one of them said, that's fine. So, and I know that they did it with other tenants, different industries. But it was really very easy. And believe it or not, we were able to catch up with them within the year, within this last year. So they didn't have to wait till the end of the lease. We caught up with them very quickly. Frankly, with the landlord downtown, he couldn't adjust for us, and wouldn't. It was his reason. We talked to him, but down there, that concept between Cityscape, which was part of the union, it's part of the same lease. It was a very large monthly rent check for the event center and for the union, with zero revenue coming in for 8 months and no prospect of business for the near future because events were gone. We didn't have weddings. We didn't have corporate. We didn't have community. All of that was just gone. So that room was going to set dark, and still to this day. And for the union takes a vibe, if you remember. I mean, that was my concept. That probably hurt me more than anything else that I can imagine. Back in 1999, when then President Elson Floyd came to me and said, I want to get downtown. What can we do? I said, well, I've always had this idea of a music venue using Western students as much as we can, and thus the term union, like student union, but it was a union of the community, and Western, it was a union of food and entertainment. I said, let's do that. And we went into a deep dive at Western as to how much talent is there. Turns out a lot. And how available is the talent? Do they want to do this? Do they want to publicly entertain? Because once you open this thing up to 3 nights a week, it's not occasionally 3 nights a week. It's 3 nights a week, 52 weeks a year, or on and on. Well, the flow of music and talent was just unbelievable. The problem is, in order to make that feel right, you can't run on 25% of your business. And at the same time, Western couldn't provide talent for a long time. So we really were forced there. I wouldn't mind taking the concept again somewhere else because it was a good concept on so many levels. We just won't be able to do it at that spot.
Thank you. We have many comments in the chat about people loving the new outdoor patio at Martell's and the Cove Pod experience. So good job. That's amazing.
Thank you, Rose.
One more question, and then we will close because I thought it was a fun one. Of all the businesses that you have been a part of, what has been your favorite?
That's an excellent question. I suppose the obvious answer was if you had 30 children, is there one that you might love more than the others? I don't know. I don't have children, but on one level, I would say B93, because when we flipped that to country, it was against the advice of everybody from specialists in the industry in terms of picking genres, et cetera, to local people, but we believed that that was right. And to take a station from that position to a national position in such a short time, that was just an exciting ride. And because it was radio and not highly technical, I did have something to do with that. I was able to truly grasp what we were doing and play a part in it more than I could with AvTech, like I said, pharmaceuticals or even orthopedics. Right up until COVID, I'll be honest with you, it'd be a close call with Millennium. The growth that I've seen in this company, and I have played a part in it, and what we have been able to do for the community through this company has been a point of pride. It has been. Last 2 years obviously has taken some of the thrill away. It's been survival as opposed to anything else. But those would probably be the one. And believe it or not, so it doesn't go back Biomet was clearly it was an investment that everybody dreams about being involved in. Unfortunately, I kind of screwed up the investment part of it, but I still stayed involved in it. That was fun. But again, if I had to pick all of them, I would probably say B93 was a wild ride and fun.
Thank you. So for those of you attending, the link for Spurs credit is in the chat feature, and I will pass it back over to Satish.
Thank you, Ken, for a fascinating presentation. And again, welcome back to the Haverco College of Business. Please join us for the next Entrepreneurship Forum on Friday, January 14th, featuring Sydney Davis, founder of Equity. Again, thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our sponsor, Blue Ox Credit Union. And I hope all of you have a great weekend.
Thank you again.
Thank you.